I'm a big fan of using a cross-functional team to work on positioning. I think a lot of companies see positioning as kind of a marketing thing, and the marketing department should just do that on their own. I think that across the company, there's a few things we have to understand. So one is different parts of the organization see the customer at different parts of the journey. Like marketing sees it at one point, sales sees it somewhere else. Product management, if they're talking to customers, they're talking to customers at a particular point. There's customer success. The founders, the CEO have a certain type of interaction with customers, but not the same as other people have with customers. So each of these major groups inside the company have a different perspective on the customer. The other thing is, because they have this different perspective, they often have a slightly different idea about what the positioning should be. So, for example, they might have a slightly different idea about who the competition is and a slightly different idea about how we stack up against the competition and therefore how we win.
We have spoken so many times on this podcast about how talking frequently with users is so important for product teams. It lets you understand user needs, test your designs, and make sure you're building the right products. But many teams tell me that they can't find time for it in their busy workday because recruiting the right users is too hard. So I want to quickly mention a company I'm advising that can help you with this. UX Signals lets you target users inside your website or app and automatically book interviews into your calendar. So you can put the recruiting on autopilot and just show up for the conversations. Instead of waiting weeks, you can get interviews within a few hours and talk to people while they'll still have the user experience fresh in their minds. It's used by big companies and public organizations like DNB Bank, Vips Mobile Pay, NAV, and many, many more who are building digital products and services with millions of users. I really recommend checking it out on uxsignals.com or by clicking the link in the show notes. Tell them Afonso sent you and you'll get a 50% off your trial. Hey there, and welcome back. Today's guest is the one and only April Dunford. I've been such a big fan of April's work, and I use some of her techniques when working with founders and product teams. I mean, positioning is so important to understand. A well-set positioning impacts what you build, which customers you'll spend most of your energy on, how you communicate, what you communicate, your business model, and so much more. And it's also often the glue between product teams and marketing and sales, a really important link. And for founders, well, it can be just what you need to take your startup to the next level, which is why I am really happy April and I discussed all things positioning, packed in a true 1-hour masterclass. You are in for a treat. But before we start, a very short message on something I'm offering that might be relevant for you. Founders and product teams struggle to test ideas effectively and find value. I see this all the time. We ship and launch new products just to find out that they don't meet our expectations. This is often because we fail to discover the real value to whom and to quickly test our ideas, which is why I've created a workshop and set of talks to help out with this. It's extremely practical, packed with examples from Scandinavian-based companies and exploring different techniques from basic to advanced that will help you uncover what your customers need and help you find the right business model. Get in touch if you're interested and let's dive in. April Dunford. April, we are live. It's so good to see you.
It's good to see you too.
All right, April, you are the author of the best-selling book, Obviously Awesome, and more recently the book Sales Pitch, How to Craft a Story to Stand Out and Win. I'm super excited to dive into Obviously Awesome, and then if we have time to Sales Pitch as well. Two really, really good books. You probably advised more B2B tech companies on positioning than anyone in the world. I think it's probably fair to say at this point. And you are a former marketing executive in companies like Huawei and IBM and others. You're an absolute legend on positioning. So I want to start asking, how came this journey on positioning? What inspired you to become an expert in this topic? And what inspired you to write a book about it?
Yeah, well, it was kind of a long journey. Like I didn't even set out to be in marketing at the beginning. Like I actually studied engineering at school, but I got a job in product marketing at a startup. And the first job I worked on, we did a repositioning exercise for a product, even though we didn't know that's what we were doing at the time. But the product was fairly unsuccessful. We repositioned it. It became very successful post-positioning. And that took off. We got acquired. I got given some other products and was asked to reposition those. And that sent me down a path of really figuring out, well, how should we be doing this stuff? Like, you know, what should a good positioning process look like? And so towards the later part of my career, when I was working in-house as a vice president of marketing, that's why you hired me. You hired me because I could talk intelligently about positioning. I had a process for doing it. And then when I basically got tired of working in-house, I made the switch to being a consultant, and it made sense for me to focus on that as my area of specialization. And then eventually I thought it made sense to write a book about it. There were a lot of clients coming to me that, you know, were very early stage startups and maybe didn't necessarily want to pay for a consultant to help them, or even didn't need to pay for a consultant to help them. All they needed was a little bit of a methodology to follow themselves. So I wrote the book to basically capture what I was doing with clients in book form. And yeah, here I am now.
Amazing. And your journey is super inspiring also with the positioning that you decided to take as a consultant as well, which is very interesting. I think consultants in general, they try to target all sorts of marketing, and I think you basically walk the talk in that too.
Yeah, I mean, it would be worrisome if the positioning consultant did not have very good positioning for herself.
Absolutely. All right. So, but you talked about early stage startups, and I also know you work with more mature companies as well. Let's start with those. Let's start with those, the more mature, the ones that already have, you know, a product out there, a product market fit. They're growing, they're scaling, but they still get positioning wrong many times. Why is that? Why do so many companies get positioning wrong, April?
Well, so here's the thing. Like, part of the reason why positioning is hard is because it isn't a static thing. Like, we don't just do it once and set it and forget about it. Like, everything is changing. Like, your own product is changing, release after release after release. Your competitors are changing because they have products that are changing release after release. The landscape itself is changing. So we have new competitors entering the market, and sometimes we have competitors exiting the market. And then buyers are changing, like things that were really important for buyers a few years ago are maybe not as important to buyers now. Sometimes we have macroeconomic forces, like we're in a recession, we're not in a recession. That changes the way buyers think about purchasing products. So because of all these factors, your positioning is going to be in a state of change. It doesn't just stay the same all the time. And sometimes you need to change it a lot. And sometimes a positioning can work for 10 years, 20 years even, and then suddenly it needs to change. Often companies fall into their positioning. Like, their positioning is obvious. Like, it's not that hard at the beginning. So they have a great idea. Maybe the market's not too crowded. There's great pull from the market, and they can get away with having positioning that they just kind of made up on the fly. They didn't follow a process to get there. The positioning was obvious. But then later, markets get more crowded. Maybe customers are feeling more price pressure, or we're in a recession and they're being a little bit more careful about where they spend their money. And suddenly you had positioning that used to work and now it's not working anymore. But the companies aren't exactly sure how to fix it because they never set the positioning deliberately using a process in the first place. So now it's broken. We don't know how to fix it. We don't know how we got it right in the first place because it just kind of happened. And so now what do we do? So I think a lot of weak positioning comes from companies having this feeling like you'll just know what the positioning is because it worked fine like that when they originally did it, or there were points in the company's history where the positioning seemed just easy and obvious. Suddenly it's not easy and obvious, but nobody actually has a process or a methodology to go in and fix it. So I think that's why this is hard.
Yeah. So let's talk about that methodology, April. What are the kind of the steps? So you walk into a company, you get some signals that the positioning is crap. What are the steps that you advise people to take? Walk us through that journey on how to fix positioning, basically.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm a big fan of using a cross-functional team to work on positioning. I think a lot of companies see positioning as kind of a marketing thing, and the marketing department should just do that on their own. I think that across the company, there's a few things we have to understand. So one is different parts of the organization see the customer at different parts of the journey. Like marketing sees it at one point, sales sees it somewhere else. Product management, if they're talking to customers or talking to customers at a particular point, there's customer success. The founders, the CEO have a certain type of interaction with customers, but not the same as other people have with customers. So each of these major groups inside the company have a different perspective on the customer. The other thing is, because they have this different perspective, they often have a slightly different idea about what the positioning should be. So, for example, they might have a slightly different idea about who the competition is and a slightly different idea about how we stack up against the competition and therefore how we win. So I think if we're going to do positioning, it makes sense to bring a cross-functional team together. Like typically I have the heads of marketing, sales, product, customer success, the founder, CEO in the room, or if it's a big company, the division head in a room. And so that's the first thing. We get a cross-functional team together. Next, if we're going to work on positioning, we can't just brainstorm our way into it. At least in my opinion, we can't. If we get a group of folks together in a room without a process, what'll happen is everybody wants to jump to the end. And so they'll just say, oh, well, why does everybody love our stuff? Let's talk about that. What do we do that's great? I think that's problematic for a few reasons. One, because people have their opinions about this. And again, not everybody knows everything about the customer. So, and then, there's politics inside a company. Like if we're just going with opinions, trust me, we're either going to take the opinion of the founder or we're going to take the opinion of the head of sales. That's usually where it goes. Marketing never wins the opinion battle. So if we have a cross-functional team together, what we need is a process to follow. In my process, we start with having a conversation about competitive alternatives, or what would a customer do if you didn't exist? This helps us to anchor on what do we need to position against, or put another way, what do we have to beat in order to win a deal? This is typically rooted in facts. I mean, if you have a sales team, your sales team knows who we compete with. They know what we're displacing as the status quo. They know what else ends in a short list. So we're kind of taking the opinions out of this first step and saying, stake in the ground. This is who we have to beat. Then once we have that, we can say, okay, well, what have we got that they don't have? So, and this is feature functions, capabilities of the product. This is easy. We can fill up whiteboards full of this stuff. Then we get to the hard part is we're going to go down that list of capabilities and we're going to translate it to value. So let's say one of the things you've got is this really neat AI capability. You say, look, we've got this advanced AI capability thing. The question I'm asking is, so what? Why does a customer care? What is the value that AI capability delivers for your customer's business? And then while we're doing that, we're looking for the themes that pop out. We don't want 29 points of value. We want 2 or 3 value themes or value buckets. At the end of the step, we should be able to say, look, we're the only company on the planet that can deliver you a combination of this value plus this value plus this value. And the features are tucked in underneath. Here's how we get it done. Once we have that, then we can have a conversation about, all right, we can sell this thing to anybody, but what are the characteristics of a target account that make them really, really care a lot about the value that only you can deliver? This is kind of a bottoms-up way of creating an ICP to say, look, like we do really good with companies that, I have an invoice processing system, but one of our big values is we can really do it at scale. Well, if you don't do a lot of invoices, you probably don't care about that. So we can make this list of things. And then the last thing is market category, which is kind of the answer to the question, what are you? So in order to determine whether a market category is good or bad, we need to look at, well, what's the differentiated value we're trying to communicate, and who are the people we're trying to communicate it to? And then we can say, well, does it make more sense for us to describe ourselves as email or chat? Are we a database or a business intelligence tool? So the last piece is market category. So in my methodology, we build it up one step at a time, starting with this idea of who do we have to position against, because we know the truth in that, and then we can build up the 5 piece points after that. So that's my methodology in a nutshell.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was brilliant. So get a cross-functional team, just to summarize. Get a cross-functional team. I love that point, and especially because positioning is sort of in the center of so many different disciplines.
like you need product because positioning will influence the value proposition and how you design the product and to whom, basically, back to your point on. And then marketing, well, there's a lot of things about marketing that I want to discuss with you, the differences between positioning, messaging, branding that people confuse all the time, but we'll get there. But marketing and then sales, I love what you said, that different people have different views and different perspectives, and you want to gather those in the same room. Then you want to look into competitive alternatives, then capabilities, features, and so on, just mapping that out, what we have today. Get into differentiated value and market category. And basically, when we talk about differentiated value, we take that and we ask ourselves, okay, who is the right customer that would be that would be the ideal customer profile, basically, the ICP for this value that we provide that nobody else does. And I really like that, because you basically flipped it around. A lot of people start with, okay, who are we going to target? We're going to target these types of customers. And
that's right.
So,
but that's often aspirational, right? Like it's like, well, the question is really, who do we want to target? But maybe we don't have a product that actually fits those people. This is more of a strategy question. Well, if we wanted to target these people, what product would we build? And that's a product strategy question. That's going to take you years to get there. The thing about positioning is, what we're actually saying is, I got a product right now that I'm trying to sell right now. I got a revenue target I have to make right now, or else we all get fired. So what's the best way to position this thing that I've got right now in the market I'm in right now, so we can maximize the revenue we're going to make right now? You might have a plan that takes you somewhere else, but that's kind of irrelevant for trying to sell stuff right now. People aren't going to give you today's dollars for the thing you have planned to build 3 years from now. They want to exchange today's dollars for the thing that you're selling right now. So we need the best possible story around that in order to make the revenue right now. Now, next year, you might have a different product because you released something else, and we'll adjust the positioning when we get there.
Absolutely. So one anti-pattern that I often see, April, is that especially founders in scale-ups, for example, they want the ICP to be, well, if not everyone, close to it.
Yeah.
And even though you go into conversations about differentiated value, there's still this temptation overall to say, well, but if we go too niche, then we are missing out. That's kind of the rhetoric. What do you say to, well, first of all, do you hear this a lot? And if so,
yes.
What do you tell them, basically? How do you tell them that it's important to be niche?
This is an old idea. And in my opinion, I think where it comes from is it comes from consumer product marketing. Like when I first started studying positioning academically, like I have an engineering degree, but later I went back and took marketing courses and read a lot of books in marketing. And a lot of what we learn about marketing fundamentals academically comes from consumer packaged goods specifically. And so if I'm trying to sell bubble gum, I want to sell that to everybody. And the original thinking on consumer packaged goods is the more general purpose I could make a thing, the more I was going to sell it. But if we're in B2B and we're selling to businesses, that's really different. It's really, really different. We're generally not trying to sell to everybody. In fact, we can't sell to everybody because everybody's got different needs and everybody's got different requirements. And so we're making something that's actually specialized for a market, an industry, a buyer, solving a certain problem. In B2B, anybody that's worked in B2B and has spent any time there, one of the first things you realize in B2B is the broader you go, the more generic you sound. And so as a startup or coming to the market very new, your only hope of winning at all is to find an underserved piece of the market and then do a very good job of serving that tiny little market. And then you gradually branch out or expand from this tiny little market you can win until you get bigger and bigger and bigger. The only companies that manage to serve a very broad market are companies that are already market leaders. And so they're kind of the de facto choice in that market. The reason everybody chooses Salesforce, and, apologies to Salesforce, but I think a lot of people would argue that Salesforce is not the best CRM on the market. People complain a lot about Salesforce. There's a lot of things that people don't like about Salesforce as a CRM, but they are a very easy choice to make because they're the undisputed market leader. You don't have to worry, is it going to be buggy or not? Is it going to work with my existing systems or not? Will my systems integrator know how to integrate with it? There's all these other things. It's very easy thing to choose. If you're new and coming into a market new, the only way to establish yourself against a competitor like that is to carve off a piece of the market that is underserved and then start there and gradually work your way around. In order to do that, you have to very specifically meet those needs better than the generic market leader. So if you came in and said, well, I'm everything for everybody. I have this thing. It's just like Salesforce. It does all the things that Salesforce does, and I'm going to target everybody. And then the first question would be, well, why wouldn't I just buy Salesforce? So it's counterintuitive. And so people think, well, the bigger the addressable market, the more customers I can target, and the more likely I'll win something, when the exact opposite is true. The smaller the addressable market, the more targeted your offering can be, which gives you an advantage over the generic market leader. And the answer to the question becomes, well, Salesforce, they're fantastic. They're fantastic for almost everybody, but not you, convenience store owner, because I've built this specifically for convenience stores, and it does 15 things that Salesforce can't do and wouldn't build because it would be too expensive for them to build a thing just for convenience stores because they got to serve everybody. So that's how it works.
I really like that point, April. This illusion of the TAM, the total addressable market, this desire for having a massive total addressable market, but then actually being just an illusion. The smaller it is for you, the more niche it is for you to ensure that you are actually obviously awesome for those group of people, right. The faster you can win that market, and the faster you can therefore expand and grow and all of that jazz. But one question comes up here, which is investors. And when you are a startup or a scale-up and you're looking at investors, some of these folks, they want big TAMs. They want big total addressable markets.
All investors are going to want you to have a giant TAM. That's a completely different thing. But yes, all investors are going to want you to have a story that says, here's this giant, nobody's investing in you to be the winner of this teeny tiny little market.
Exactly. So how do you navigate that as a founder or as a business leader in a scale-up?
Yeah.
How do you navigate that?
Yeah. So there's a difference between what you're selling today, in a sales situation to customers, and what you're talking about to an investor. So what you're talking about to an investor is the vision. Right. And the investor, particularly if you're very early stage, the investor doesn't care that much about what you're selling today or what you're doing today. What they really care about is, what's the vision? Like, what are you going to be in 5 years, in 10 years? And how big is that? And how are you going to get from where you are now to where you are then? And are you the right team to do that? And what is your secret sauce to get there? Like, why you instead of any of the other companies that are in this market already? So we have this vision, which is this longer term thing. It's this all singing, all dancing, amazing product that we're going to have in the market 5-10 years from now. But that's not what we have right now. What we have right now is this kind of crappy thing that only does 2 little things, and that's it. But we need to survive long enough to build the other things that enable us to, 5 years from now, reposition ourselves as that other thing. So I think that companies need to keep the two things very separate. The positioning for investors, it's a different timeline, it's a different value proposition, it's a different thing than the way we're positioning to customers right now. Like in the early days of Salesforce, for example, if you listen to Mark Benioff talking to investors, he was talking about this, platform as a service and what this was going to look like and, how SaaS was going to look like in the future and it was going to be amazing. But that was his story for investors. And that's what he told investors. He might tell that story at the big company meeting when all the media is there, and he's talking about the far, far future. That is not the story you heard from a sales rep if a sales rep called you to sell you some CRM. If a sales rep called you to tell you some CRM, the sales rep said, look, we're going to give you the same CRM that all the big companies are using, because everybody forgets that Salesforce started out at the bottom of the market selling to SMBs. They said, look, you can get the same thing the big guys are using, but you don't have to have an IT department to take care of it. You know why? No software. That's it. That's a whole sales pitch. They were out there saying platform as a service, blah, blah, blah. Customers didn't even know what that was back then, and nobody cared, right? So the way he was pitching to investors was completely not the story he was telling in his advertisements, in his marketing campaigns, in the actual pitch that a salesperson was giving on the ground to a new prospect. Those two things should be very different.
Very good point. All right, so moving back to the steps, to the 5 steps that you mentioned before, where do most companies struggle, you think, in your experience, facilitating these processes and going in and changing things for them and with them? Where do they struggle the most, and what are some of the mental models to help overcome those typical challenges that you found?
Yeah, so handful of things. So I would say the number one problem is the companies will try to jump to doing value without thinking about competitors first. And when they do think about competitors, they define competitors incorrectly. So this is what it looks like. They'll say, like I'll say, who's your competitor? And they'll say, oh, we have all these competitors. And they'll list a big, long list of competitors. But none of these competitors actually show up in a deal. So when a customer comes to buy them, you'll say, well, are those competitors on the short list? Are the customers seriously considering this other competitor? And they'll say, well, no. And it's like, okay, well, they're not your competitor then. Doesn't mean so when I say who's your competitor, it's not who could compete with you. It's who actually does in the deals.
Exactly.
There a customer says, we're looking at 3 companies. All you have to do is beat those other 2. And that's it. I don't have to beat the ones that never make it on the list. So I don't have to worry about positioning against them. The second thing when it comes to competitors is often your main competitor is a spreadsheet or an intern or do it manually. Things that don't actually end up on the short list, but the company's getting by using that stuff right now. And so you're going to have something that is exponentially better to motivate them to go through the actual process, to buy something new, spend money on something new, go through the pain of changing to something new. It has to be way better than just doing it on a spreadsheet, which, maybe that's a little bit of a pain in the neck, but your thing's going to have to be much, much better than that. So the first, I think that, the main mistake I think people make with positioning is they don't understand what they have to beat in order to win a deal. So they're doing this positioning that's, way too broad because they're trying to include every little competitor under the sun that they can Google that looks vaguely like them. And therefore their positioning gets really generic, really vague, really broad, and or they have completely forgotten about the option of, hey, I could just hire an intern to do this. And that'd be pretty easy too. So maybe I should just do that. So number one, I think people don't understand who their real competition is. And if they thought about that and got clarity on that, then their positioning would shift. The second thing is second most common thing I see is a lot of companies are building their positioning as though question they have to answer from customers is, why pick us? And the reality is, in most situations, it's competitive if it's B2B. And so the question isn't really, why pick you? The question is, why pick you over the other guys? And so why pick you over the other companies on the short list? Or why pick you over doing it with a spreadsheet or doing it with an intern? And so we don't, it's not just about how great we are. It's about how we can do things differently than the other approaches and the value in doing it our way versus anybody else's way. Mm-hmm. So that's what I think are the main things people mess up on this.
Nice. So you mentioned before the whole marketing thing on messaging and branding and so on, and sort of the way you've learned marketing from academia. These concepts are very clear in academia because people are very detailed on how they articulate things. But I think that folks in practice, practitioners, then everything gets a bit messy. Like if you have a CMO in a startup, that person might think that okay, messaging is the same as positioning. It's like the positioning is the communication. So just for folks that are listening, what are some of these differences, like branding, positioning, and messaging, and why is it important that we get them clear?
Yeah. So in my opinion, positioning defines the set of inputs we need to do almost everything in marketing and sales. So if you came to me and said, okay, April, you're my vice president of marketing, we need new messaging for the homepage, I'd say, great. Who's the messaging for? And like, who do we compete with? How do we beat them? So what's our differentiated value proposition? What does our ideal customer look like? There'd be all these questions, right? And so positioning provides those answers. So positioning defines who's my competitor, how am I different, what's the value I can deliver no one else can, who's a really good fit for this value, so what does my ICP look like in great detail, what's the market I intend to win. And so that is an input to messaging. Messaging is very different depending on where you're using that messaging. So you will have messaging for the homepage, and perhaps the goal of that messaging is to drive people to sign up to a trial, for example. And so you're not trying to message everything. You're just trying to message the things that will motivate people to sign up for a trial. You might be running a campaign at a specific subset of your audience, and the messaging there will be very different because, there's something going on in the world, or there's a campaign and you're running right at that is only relevant to those people. So you're going to write messaging for that. You might have a trade show you're going to, and you're going to have a trade show booth and banners and maybe a handout or something. And there will be specific messaging for that. So messaging will take positioning as an input, but then it will adapt that positioning to the particular situation that the messaging is there to solve. So maybe it's a landing page, maybe it's a home page, maybe it's something else. So I think there's all kinds of messaging, and that's not just cookie cutter. It's not like you write messaging once and it's the same everywhere. It's not. So, but positioning is an input to that. Same thing with when we talk about branding. Branding's a harder one because I find that marketers define branding in so many different ways. Like sometimes people come to me and they'll define branding in a way where I think it's indistinguishable from positioning. But in my world, in the companies that I've worked in, which is generally enterprise B2B, branding is kind of our word that we use for a combination of things like, what is the tone of voice that we want to use in our communication? What is our brand personality? That represents itself in the colors we choose to use and the fonts we're using and the type of iconography or imagery we're choosing to use comes together to give this kind of feel for what this company is all about. Again, I think it's very hard to build that if you didn't know who are we trying to sell to and what is the value we're trying to communicate. Like if I'm trying to sell to daycare operators and my message is all about engaging kids, then I would expect the brand to be very playful and fun and bright colors and, it would make me feel fun and all this stuff. If I'm selling cybersecurity to a bank, I would expect my branding to be very serious and blue and corporate and all that kind of, trustworthy and all that kind of stuff. How do you decide one or the other? Well, I need positioning first. I need to know what's the value I'm trying to communicate. Who am I trying to communicate it to? I need that as an input. So I think ideally, again, I need positioning as an input to figure out branding. It's the same thing when we get over on the sales side of stuff. Like, a sales pitch, in my opinion, is a very specific way of communicating your positioning for a very specific situation. So we typically don't call that messaging, but it is in a way, right? It's a story told in a very specific way to help a customer understand why pick us over the other guys.
I love this. And April, so when I started reflecting about positioning a bit more harder in my career, I really started to see this as the glue, as I mentioned before, for product, because product people, they need positioning to design a better product. Or let's say even like zoom out, design needs to understand the positioning to design a better product. Product, as part of the cross-functional team building the product, the so-called product teams, they need to understand the positioning. Marketing needs to understand the positioning to market the product, sales to sell. But it's like this, even if product would have a positioning or marketing, sometimes this handover, gets sort of lost in translation.
Totally.
So why is that? Is it because they were not part of that cross-functional team that you mentioned before, or is there something else?
Often, often that's it. Like, I think it's natural inside companies that each functional team sees the customer or interacts with the customer in very different situations, right? So sales is seeing the customer at this point where they are evaluating and trying to figure out between their options. And that is a very specific situation. Whereas if you go to the product management team, often the product management team is funny. Like, they will do a lot of talking to existing customers, so they've already bought. They are not in the process of evaluating. They are familiar with their stuff, and now they want new features, or they want new stuff. And so product management is seeing in that situation. Or some companies, what you get is product management gets called in with a prospect, but only when the prospect sucks. So it's a problematic deal. If it was an easy deal, we wouldn't need product management's help to try to close it. So maybe they're only seeing this subsection of customers. Marketing, on the other hand, like, again, they're talking a lot to existing customers, so they're doing customer case studies or references and things like this. So they're talking to existing customers. They're talking to prospects, maybe, depending on what they do, but it's often way further up in the funnel from where sales is talking to them. Then you got customer success, and customer success, again, they're getting a negative viewpoint because they're only talking to the people that have problems, and they're only talking to customers post-sale for the most part, not so much pre-sales. And then you've got like the CEO, and the CEO, again, he gets called in on special cases. There's a big deal we're trying to close. If you've got a sales rep that does 50 deals during the year, maybe the CEO got involved in 3, right? Or the senior executive or whoever we're talking about. So they've talked to 3, but those 3 were special. They were big, they were complicated, they were whatever. Yeah. So they've got this very skewed thing. So when you gather this team together and you ask something really simple, like who do we compete with, it's not unusual to get 12 different answers.
Absolutely. Because
the division executive will say, oh, we compete with Oracle because that's who we competed with when we were on that deal in Walmart. But your sales rep might say, dude, that was the only deal we ever had where Walmart showed up. And that was because it was a weird case and it was so big and whatever. Same thing with product management. Product management, in my opinion, they're worried about roadmap. So they're not just worried about today. They're also worried about the future and how do we get to the future. So it is natural for them to think about what I would call a horizon competitor, a competitor that isn't a competitor right now, but once we release this new thing, then maybe we will compete with them. So they have a different view even when you're thinking about competition because they're living in the future a little bit. And then marketing, if you ask them about competition, marketing will be worried about whoever your competitor is that's spending a lot of money on marketing. And they'll say, oh, these guys are all over our keywords, and these guys are dominating whatever, and, we see them everywhere. They're copying our stuff, and, and they won't be maybe as worried about a competitor that may actually be a much bigger threat, but doesn't spend a lot of money on marketing, so marketing doesn't get exposed to their stuff. So this comes back to this idea that if we really want to get good positioning and have that positioning stick, we somehow need to get all these different parts of the organization on the same page. In my experience, the best way to do that is, well, let's get everybody together because I actually want to know this input from everyone, but let's get everyone together, work on positioning together. And not only do I get the benefit of everybody's input, I also get the benefit of, we're going to work through the positioning together as a team so that by the time we get to the end, we are all in agreement and alignment on that, so we can all go back representing the same positioning. I don't know how you ever get there if you don't have a cross-functional team working on this stuff.
Absolutely. And this is also one of the reasons I love to bring a product marketing manager into a cross-functional product team. Because then you have engineering, you have design, you have product management, and you have product marketing, and they're part of the same team collaborating and trying to nail this stuff.
Yeah.
Because what you often see, at least here in Norway, April, and Scandinavia in general, what I see a lot is massive fragmentation between these disciplines, and so they don't get to talk. They only get to talk when the product is already designed, and that's the problem, because then it's already, the position is already constrained in a way.
Yes.
So we can't. So anyway, so then that's why the friction kind of happens and so on. So but assuming then you have a well-crafted positioning, how do you translate that into a killing sales pitch? I have your book right here for those who were listening on YouTube. Let's dig into this masterpiece a little bit, April. How do you then translate into a killing sales pitch?
Well, so, when I started doing this stuff, I just assumed that tech companies had a way of building a sales pitch already. Like all the companies I'm working with, they're B2B, they have sales teams. Everybody has a sales pitch that they're using right now. So I just assumed that maybe, if you went to sales training, you would learn how to build a sales pitch, and that's, a previously solved problem. But when I started doing this work on positioning with clients after I became a consultant, what I generally recommended to my clients as a way to test positioning was to take the positioning, translate it into a sales pitch, and then test it with live qualified prospects. And the beauty of testing it that way versus A/B testing on a landing page, for example, is that you get a lot more signal. So I can control for a lot more things. So I know exactly who I'm talking to, unlike A/B tests on a landing page. Am I actually getting the right traffic? Is it the right people? With a live conversation, I know exactly who I'm talking to. I can get a lot of signal, like, if they're screwing up their face, like they're confused, or if they're getting really excited, I can see that in their body language of what's happening. And then we can try stuff out. I don't have just the wording on the page. People can ask me questions, and there's context and things you can do in a sales pitch that you could never do on an A/B test on a landing page. So that's what I was recommending to people. We'll just turn it into a sales pitch and we'll test the positioning that way. That's how we should do it. And the way I would do it with customers is I'd say, well, do you have a sales pitch structure that you want? If so, we'll just translate the positioning into your structure. And all the companies I worked with said, well, we have a pitch, but it's really more of a product walkthrough. We're just showing them all the features. We're not talking about value too much. We're not trying to explain the landscape or where we fit in the landscape. And so I started teaching people the sales pitch structure that I had been using, which came from it originally came from IBM. When I worked at IBM, they had a sales pitch structure they used that came from these consultants called the Corporate Executive Board that were these famous sales consultants back in the day. They wrote a book called The Challenger Sale. And anyways, IBM had done a consulting engagement with these guys, and part of that engagement was they ended up with a pitch structure. And so I used that when I was at IBM. Anyways, I left IBM and I worked at a startup and started with that pitch structure and modified it because, the deals weren't as big and the sales cycles weren't as long. And there were a lot of things you wouldn't do because you're not IBM. And then I've been using an evolving version of that structure ever since. So it's been 20 years or so that I've been using this sales pitch structure. So what I started to recognize in the clients I worked with is nobody had a sales pitch structure that they liked. Like everybody had this sales pitch, but when you ask them, where did that sales pitch come from? It was all like blank stares. Everybody's like, well, I don't know. We added slide number 6 last year. And so there's this pitch that has been around since the year of the flood. And nobody knows where it came from. And nobody wants to mess with it too much because the salespeople are comfortable with it and whatever. And nobody really likes it. But nobody knows, like, if we blow it up, well, what's the alternative? Nobody knows. So I started teaching my sales pitch structure because I knew it, and I could explain how the pieces map to positioning, and we get to something, and I'd say, look, if you don't want to use this structure, don't use it. But, I'm just giving you an example of what the sales pitch could look like. So then all my clients started using it, and I thought, okay, well, maybe this is another interesting book to write, is to just look, like, if you don't like your sales pitch structure, I'm not saying this is the best one ever, but it's a lot better than no structure at all. So here's how I would do it. If you have your positioning, this is how I would map it out. So that's how the second book came about, because I was doing it with clients anyways. And it seemed like a lot of people were struggling with sales pitches and how to figure out how to get their positioning to map to a sales pitch. So I thought, all right, that's another contribution I can make. I just write that thing down. And at least you're starting with something rather than nothing.
Absolutely. So what are the key steps into crafting the sales pitch? And again, same question, what are the things that you see people struggling the most?
Yeah. Well, so I think the biggest mistake people make in sales pitches is, again, they're trying to answer this question, why pick us? Instead of trying to answer the question, why pick us over the other guys? Which is what the customer really wants answered. And so because they think, oh, well, I just have to get you to like my stuff in isolation, then most companies are convinced if I just show you the stuff, then you'll love it. So, there's 5 drop-down menus. I'm going to click on all 5, and I'm going to click on every single option underneath those 5, and I'm going to show you every single thing and explain how it works. And it puts the effort all back on the customer. It's up to the customer to decide, well, does everybody have these features, or do just you have these features? And why do these features matter? Like, to me, in my business, like that, all that is put on the customer. It's like, I'm just going to show you the facts, Jack. That's it, and you make up your own mind. And so we call it a sales pitch, but there's actually not a lot of selling going on there. It's more of a product expose, and that's it. So I think that's the main problem. A better way to do this, in my opinion, and if you read the research on this and the books that have been written about this, a better way to do this is, first of all, to help the customer understand the entire market. And we don't have to spend all day on this. And most of the clients that I work with, we do it in as little as a minute, sometimes 2 minutes, but we're painting a picture of the whole market and saying, look, there's 3 or 4 different ways to approach this problem, right? You could approach it by using individual piece part products to solve it, or you could use a platform. Right? Or you could approach this problem by having a content management system, or you could have a learning management system. And those 2 ways of solving it are different. And there's pluses and minuses for each one. And here's where we fit. So I think the first thing the customer needs to know is, what's the universe of choices, and where do you fit in the middle of that universe of choices? And then if we're doing a really great job of this, we have inherently, like when we built our product, we had a point of view. And the point of view was, look, I'm building a new email system, and I know what I hate about email, right? And when I build an email system, it's going to be great. It's going to be better than those things because it's going to have these things. So I had a point of view that said, for people like me, this part of email sucks, so I'm going to build the email for people like me that wants this other thing. We should communicate that in the sales pitch to say, look, like, we think that customers like you, and we work with customers like you, they struggle with this. And if you look at all the other ways of solving the problem, those things are good and bad for different reasons, but nobody's getting at this thing. And that's why we built what we built. Now let me show it to you. So we need this little bit of context at the beginning that explains why our differentiated value matters to the customer, and gives the customer a way to sort of slot any other product into a box and understand why that's not the same as us. And then when we go to show them the features, we don't just show them all the features and have them figure out what's important and what isn't. We basically say, look, if you come work with us, we can deliver value A, value B, value C that no one else can. Let me show you how we do that. 1, we're going to make it, 200% faster to do invoices. Let me show you the features that enable that. 2, we're going to save you $1 million a year. Here's how we do it. 3, we're going to do this. And so we're not just exposing you to just a fire hose of features out of context. We're explaining why did we build what we built? What's our point of view on the market? How do we compare to everyone else and what makes us different? Now I'm going to show you the value we can deliver and the features that enable it. That's what a good first call sales pitch looks like, in my opinion. So my structure maps to that.
Very good. I really like the fact that you said you want to make their life easier, and this is a point you've made before, and in your book as well. Buying is hard.
So hard.
And people
it's amazing anybody buys anything. It's so hard, right? Like when you think about it,
Absolutely.
in B2B, generally, we're selling to customers that have never bought a thing like ours before, right? Like I was talking to a client of mine a couple of hours ago, and they sell a thing, and it's for knowledge worker automation. Like, that's not even a system that existed before my clients decided that was a thing. Like, nobody has bought that before. And so you're a buyer and you've got these problems you need to solve and you need to figure that out. Like, you don't know who the vendors are. You don't know what's possible and not possible in the market. You don't know what features are important or not important to companies that look like you. So, you know, one of the things you want in a sales call is you want to understand the whole market. You want to understand how this thing fits in the whole market, but you're also quite nervous about making a poor choice because you never did this before. And you got to go to your boss and say, hey, I think we should buy this thing and you should give me $1 million so we could go buy this thing. Like, if you make a bad choice there, bad things are going to happen. Like, you know, maybe you don't get promoted. Maybe you get fired. Like, maybe everyone hates you because you're the guy that picked that terrible thing. And now we're all stuck using it. So it's a risky thing for a customer to stick their neck out and champion your product inside an organization to get a deal done. I think we underestimate that in enterprise software. And I think that the more things we can do to help the customer understand the context we operate in, meaning not just us, but everybody, what does the whole market look like? That's going to help a customer have more confidence in their ability to pick the right thing that is the right fit for them. Even if that means sometimes, you know, you're not the right fit.
Absolutely. April, I would love to go on for another hour, but time is running up. And just to wrap up, you've basically had a fantastic progress since you started. You've become became this expert in positioning. I want to ask you: is there anything that you've done differently earlier in your career, and what's your general advice for people who want to progress faster in their career and maybe people that aspire to be where you are today?
Oh, well, you know, a lot of my career did not go as planned, but I think that's okay. Like, you know, I think, like, I worked at a lot of companies that got acquired. So what that meant was I was at a tiny, tiny little company, and then we get acquired, and then you're at the big, big company. And usually, you know, they make it worth your while to hang around for a little bit. Then you hang around for a bit there, a couple of years, and then you go. And so I did a lot of bouncing back and forth between big companies and small companies. And in hindsight, I thought that was very good. Like, I learned a lot in the contrast. It's hard to architect that. Like, that just kind of was the way it happened to me. But I don't think I'd be as smart as I am right now if I had only worked at small companies or only worked at big companies. Like, I thought having a mix in the experience was actually quite good for me. And then, yeah, if I think back about things that I would have done differently, like, I started thinking about consulting after I had been working in-house for about 20 years. But I didn't want to be a consultant. I like being on a team. Like, I like being on a team. I like being part of a startup. I like the energy of that. And I liked it. And in particular, I like the team atmosphere. And I was like, I don't want to go be my own thing, you know, because I'm not on a team anymore. But I wish I had have done it like a little bit earlier. Like, I wouldn't have been smart enough to do it when I was junior. So I needed that experience. before I made the switch to consulting. But it's specifically, if I think about the last job that I had, I shouldn't have taken that job. You know, I was starting to consult. They were one of my clients. I ended up flipping into there to do a stint as their COO. I shouldn't have took that job. I should have just kept consulting. It would have been better. But I kind of needed to have, you know, to really work the in-house thing out of my system
Yeah.
before I was really sure that, yeah, okay, this part of my career is over and now I'm on to the other things. But I don't look back at a lot of stuff in my career and feel regret, to be honest. Like I felt like, you know, even the bad experiences were things that I needed to have that experience in order to really understand, like, yeah, that's a thing I don't want to do. That. And doing that once is enough, April. You don't have to do that again. But sometimes the only way to learn that is to actually have the miserable experience and then go, yeah, no, that wasn't good. Let's not do that again.
Absolutely. Totally agree. Unfortunately. But very good. April, it's been such a pleasure. Just so, last question, just so that listeners can know where to find you, where should people go?
Yeah, like, you know, I think the books are always a good place to start, just because, you know, it's an efficient way to learn a bunch of my thinking in a short period of time. They're not long books. They're easy books to read. The first book, obviously Awesome, focuses on positioning. The second one, Sales Pitch, focuses on, you know, translating that positioning into sales pitch. I think obviously Awesome's the right one to start with, and then to read the Sales Pitch one as a follow-up if you have a sales team. I have a website. It's aprildunford.com. I write a newsletter. It's a bit sporadic, but I generally don't write something unless I got something I think is good that people need to hear. I also have a podcast myself. It's called Positioning with April Dunford, and that drops about every second week or so. And so podcasts are things you can listen there. But yeah, that's where you can find me. And then I'm on LinkedIn. I think that's really only the only social media I really use regularly. And even there, I'm not very regular, but you can follow me on LinkedIn, April Dunford. I'm easy to find.
Perfect. All right, we'll add those in the show notes. April, thank you so much for joining. It's been a really insightful conversation.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me.
All right, that was it for today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Make sure you subscribe to my newsletter so you don't miss out, and see you next time.